Ever notice how a comment from someone miles away can spark a whole debate right here at home? Well, that's exactly what we're diving into today. We're taking a deep dive into some recent remarks from U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance about the UK's economic landscape.
Hmm.
And his argument basically boils down to this idea that high levels of low-skilled immigration in both the UK and Canada have actually played a major role in our sluggish economic growth and a dip in our national productivity.
Right, you've hit the nail on the head.
Oh,
And today we're going to really dissect Vance's argument, unpack his central claim, and explore those counter-arguments that have been raised.
exactly.
Because it's a complex issue, and hopefully by the end of this, we'll all have a much clearer understanding of this really intricate picture.
Absolutely. And, at the heart of Vance's view is this idea that when businesses have easy access to a large pool of people willing to work for less, it kind of takes away the pressure to invest in those cutting edge technologies, automation and more efficient processes, the very things that could really boost our productivity without needing to rely on simply hiring more and more people.
Yeah.
And he put it rather bluntly, actually. The title of the video we're looking at suggests that cheap labor has made the UK lazy, giving companies the easy way out.
Strong words.
Pretty strong stuff.
It is a direct connection that he's drawing, and I think what's so fascinating here is how he links immigration policy directly to these fundamental economic drivers like productivity and investment.
Yes.
His thinking is that when labor is abundant and cheap, it naturally discourages businesses from seeking out more innovative and efficient ways of doing things.
Hmm.
Because why would you spend money on new machinery or processes if you can just hire more hands at a lower cost?
Mm.
It's the path of least resistance.
It's the easy way out. Yeah. And, as we see in the GB News transcript we're looking at, Vance's comments have certainly stirred up a lot of debate here in the UK. And one significant counterargument is that the UK's productivity issues are much more deeply rooted in structural problems.
Oh, absolutely.
Just think about how incredibly difficult and expensive it is to get major infrastructure projects off the ground in this country. Things like new railways, better roads, even just building more homes.
It's a nightmare, a complete nightmare.
It's a nightmare. And the transcript really highlights these layers of bureaucracy involved, the impact of various regulations, the effect of judicial reviews, basically legal challenges that can really delay or even halt projects altogether.
Oh, yeah.
And of course, the considerable environmental costs associated with infrastructure development.
Of course.
These are all significant hurdles that can slow progress and inflate costs, regardless of how readily available labor might be.
Absolutely. And it makes you wonder. It really makes you wonder, could it be that an abundance of low-skilled labor actually enables companies to navigate these cumbersome regulations more easily,
Interesting.
thus masking the true cost of these structural inefficiencies and delaying calls for reform? It's rarely just one thing at play in economics, is it?
It's never simple, right? It's a complex web. And, the transcript even throws in another really intriguing point, noting that the UK's productivity growth seems to have slowed down around the time the 2008 Climate Change Act was introduced.
Mm. Mm.
Now, it's very careful to say this might not be a direct cause,
Right.
but it does suggest that major shifts in policy and national priorities can have those far-reaching economic consequences.
Precisely. Just because two things happen around the same time doesn't mean one caused the other.
Right.
But it certainly prompts us to consider the broader policy environment. How do different pieces of legislation interact with economic performance?
Yeah.
A strong focus on environmental goals, while absolutely vital in itself,
Of course.
could potentially influence business investment and the costs of doing business, which in turn could affect productivity in ways we're still trying to fully understand.
It's a ripple effect.
It is.
And then, of course, we can't ignore the massive elephant in the room, the impact of the 2008 global financial crisis.
Mm-hmm.
The transcript emphasizes its significant after effects, and it puts forward this really interesting idea that the availability of cheap, low-skilled labor might have actually prolonged the survival of what are sometimes called zombie companies.
Oh, yeah.
So let's unpack that idea for a moment.
What's
What's fascinating here is this thought that Cheap labor, combined with those super low interest rates and readily available credit that followed the financial crisis, might have inadvertently prevented a necessary economic shakeup.
Right.
The theory is that in a healthy economic downturn, struggling, less efficient businesses would typically fail, making room for stronger, more innovative ones to grow and take their place.
Absolutely.
But if cheap labor allows those weaker firms to keep going, it can stifle overall productivity growth across the whole economy.
It really can. It's almost like an economic life support system that prevents the patient from fully recovering and becoming stronger.
Wow, I like that analogy. It's like propping them up. And the transcript even touches on the Austrian business cycle theory, suggesting that those low interest rates, and you could perhaps draw a parallel to an abundance of low-skilled labor,
Yeah.
can actually prevent the kind of tough decisions and hard work needed for real long-term economic progress.
It's like delaying the inevitable.
Exactly.
It's like kicking the can down the road.
Absolutely.
And the transcript very cleverly suggests a potential parallel. An oversupply of cheap labor might similarly mask underlying inefficiencies within businesses and delay those necessary structural improvements and investments in efficiency.
It's a really interesting parallel. But then, just when you think you're starting to grasp the complexities, the transcript throws another curveball. It presents a counter-argument about how difficult it actually was for businesses in the UK to access credit after the financial crisis,
Yeah.
suggesting that stricter regulations on a smaller number of large UK banks, compared to the more diverse banking system in the US,
Right.
might have actually limited how much they were willing to lend.
Yeah. And therefore, how much businesses could invest regardless of the labor situation. This raises a really important question about how all these different economic factors are interconnected.
It does.
While Vance focuses on the supply of labor, this perspective highlights the crucial role of access to capital. If businesses are struggling to secure loans for investing in new technologies or expanding their operations, then whether or not there's a surplus of low-skilled labor might become less of a primary concern.
Right?
The regulatory response to the financial crisis, while intended to make the financial system more stable, might have had unintended consequences for business investment and therefore productivity growth.
Unintended consequences, yeah.
So we've discussed how the availability of cheap labor might have prolonged the life of less efficient firms. However, the transcript also raises an important point about whether businesses even had the means to invest in improvements, regardless of labor costs.
Yeah, it's chicken and egg, isn't it? It's a really good point.
It is.
And it really underscores just how complex this whole picture is.
Oh, it does.
As the transcript itself, Riley notes, you get a room full of economists, and you'll likely end up with even more opinions.
Probably even more arguments as well.
It's a good reminder that there are rarely simple, straightforward answers to these big economic questions.
There really aren't.
And the discussion then broadens out to consider the overall economic impact of migration in the UK, which is, of course, a central part of Vance's original comments.
Yeah.
And the transcript raises some really pertinent points about our social safety net.
It does.
This idea that in a country like the UK with a relatively generous social safety net, there's a level of income below which some workers might not be net contributors to the economy.
Right.
Especially when you take into account the cost of social support and public services they might access.
And the dependents as well.
Yes. And then, of course, there's the consideration of the dependence of those workers and the impact on things like our education system.
Exactly. And what's particularly interesting here is this shift from simply viewing migration as an automatic economic benefit to also considering the potential economic costs, especially in the context of a well-developed welfare state.
Yeah.
The transcript frames these not as definitive conclusions, but as important questions we need to be asking. At what point might high levels of migration, particularly of lower-skilled workers, shift the balance from being primarily an economic opportunity to potentially becoming a net economic cost?
It's a really crucial question to be asking.
It is.
And a challenging one as well. But ultimately, as the transcript we've been looking at concludes, Vance's comments have really sparked this important debate about the UK's economic policies and the potential impact of sustained high levels of migration.
It's been a real catalyst.
Absolutely. And there's a clear suggestion that a much deeper look needs to be taken at how all these factors connect.
It's not a simple issue.
It really isn't. So to bring this deep dive to a close, we've really dug into J.D. Vance's argument, linking significant low-skilled immigration to lower economic growth and reduced productivity in the UK, using that GB News transcript as our main guide.
Yeah.
We also explored those counter-arguments presented, focusing on those substantial structural challenges within the UK, the potential influence of environmental policies and the global financial crisis, and the complexities surrounding access to credit for businesses. Finally, we touched on the wider economic considerations of migration in the context of the UK's social safety net.
It's been a really thorough exploration.
It has, and as always, our aim here wasn't to provide definitive answers or to endorse any particular viewpoint,
Of course not.
but rather to thoroughly explore the different arguments and perspectives laid out in the source material, giving you the information you need to draw your own informed conclusions.
That's what we're here for.
Exactly. Which leads us to our final thought for you to ponder. Considering all those various factors we've discussed today, from levels of immigration to deep-seated structural issues and the availability of finance, what single policy change, if any, do you believe would have the most significant positive impact on the UK's productivity in the long run?
Ooh, that's a tough one.
And what evidence would you look for to support that belief? It's a really intricate puzzle, and your perspective is a really important piece of it.
Good luck with that one.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure as always.
We'll see you next time.
See you then.